Hello, thank you. So again, good afternoon, and my name is Antonia Rakestraw. I'm a member of the Community-Based Organization Initiatives team, and on behalf of the National Center for HIV/AIDS, Viral Hepatitis, STD, and TB Prevention, here in the Division of HIV/AIDS Prevention in the Prevention Program Branch, I'd like to welcome you to the first of 3 scheduled Capacity Building Assistance webinars for Funding Opportunity Announcement PS 17-1704, Comprehensive High Impact HIV Prevention Projects for Young Men of Color who have sex with men and young transgender persons of color. Today's webinar presentation will be on developing and implementing culturally competent HIV prevention programs. The webinar topics were chosen based on common capacity building assistance requests and are part of a comprehensive effort to ensure that interested applicants have an opportunity to hear and view presentations that will assist in developing their applications. So during this webinar, we will not be addressing FOA-specific questions, but we'll focus entirely on today's topic. If you have questions regarding PS 17-1704, I'm going to encourage you to visit the website. There's a frequently asked questions document there. And you can also always send your questions to cbofoa@cdc.gov. And so today's presentation will be presented by Dr. Giselle Pemberton. She's a public health leader with over 2 decades experience building sustainable public health programs that respond to the needs of countries and communities. She's worked in the field of HIV/AIDS, substance abuse, and reproductive health, both domestically and internationally, and she's currently employed at Proceed as the Director of National Center for Training, Support, and Technical Assistance. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pemberton.
Thank you, Antonia. That was a lovely introduction, and greetings, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be conducting this webinar in collaboration with CDC and in support of PS 17-1704. It's the first of a 3-part series, as Antonia just mentioned. And, thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar on cultural competence. It's a topic that's often left as an afterthought, but which remains integral to stigma eradication and the delivery of quality HIV prevention, care, and treatment services. So let me begin by giving you a brief review of what to expect on today. So here's the agenda. We've pretty much covered the welcome and opening remarks. The webinar itself is divided into 3 segments. The first segment provides an overview of cultural competence, and we introduce the national standards on culturally and linguistically appropriate services. From here on in, I'll refer to those standards as CLAS. In the second segment, we'll talk about how healthcare providers, how those of you that are on this call can put some of the CLAS standards into action within your setting. And in the final segment, we'll talk about priority populations. We will discuss best practices when working with African Americans, Latinos, MSM, young MSM, and transgendered persons, as well as persons who inject drugs. And finally, we will provide some information on some resources that you may use to help you as you develop your programs or design your programs or propose your programs for PS 17-1704. I should also mention that during each segment, there will be poll questions, but we will provide instructions as we go along. So let's just briefly look at these learning objectives, and clearly folks can read. So what we're going to do is discuss the national standards for CLAS as in its application to HIV prevention, care, and treatment as a way of conceptualizing, developing, and implementing culturally competent HIV programs, and also employing strategies where your staff, organizations, stakeholders, and communities can be engaged in the delivery of culturally competent services. We'll also talk about, as I mentioned in the previous slide, strategies for working with priority populations. And here is the list of priority populations. So let's move right on in and get started. So start with this. We're going to talk about cultural competence, and I would like to pose the question, does cultural competence matter? And is it still relevant 35 years into the HIV/AIDS epidemic? Haven't we gotten it by now? And these are some of the questions that are posed to me by colleagues in the field when we talk about cultural competence. And it's a question that some of you may have, asking, why are we still having webinars on cultural competence? I would venture to say that cultural competence is one of those things that most of us, especially those of us that have been doing this work for some time, believe we have achieved, or that we do well for one of the reasons listed on the slide that you're looking at. Although I believe that we've achieved a certain level of cultural competence in HIV/AIDS prevention and care after 35 years, there's still quite a bit that individuals and organizations can do. So if you just speak to someone who's never been offered an HIV test for not fitting the profile, or a young man who's been newly diagnosed with HIV but feels unwelcome or misunderstood by his healthcare provider or team, or a transgender woman who is continuously asked to check boxes on forms that do not reflect who she is or how she defines herself, then it becomes quite clear to all of us why cultural competence is as relevant today as it ever was. I should also mention that, the U.S. demographics, we have a shifting demographics on what I call the browning of the population, meaning that African Americans, American Indians, Asian Americans, Latinos, and other minority groups will make up roughly 57% of the U.S. population by 2060. Right now, we're currently around 37%. So this should provide you with a little bit of a perspective. Now, in terms of the specifics around HIV/AIDS and why cultural competence matters, we know that when we're talking about HIV prevention and treatment, there are startling disparities. Gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men of all races and ethnicities remain the most profoundly impacted by HIV. So although MSM represents anywhere from 2 to 4% of the male population in the U.S., in 2010, MSM accounted for 63% of all new infections. We also talk about Black people, African Americans, who I will refer to as African Americans from this point forward, continue to experience the most severe burden. So we're looking at rates where at some point in their lifetimes, 1 in 16 Black men and 1 in 32 Black women may be diagnosed with HIV infection, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control. And Latinos show a similar trajectory, comprising only 17% of the population, but accounting for 23%. People who inject drugs represented 8% of new infections in 2010, which is the latest data on the CDC website. But in certain regions, such as Puerto Rico, we know that a much higher percentage of people who inject drugs account for new infections. And although there is very little data on transgender persons, we know that this population faces unprecedented stigma and discrimination and are disproportionately impacted by HIV/AIDS. And finally, we know that there are geographic differences in HIV/AIDS incidence and modes of transmission. For example, the southern U.S. is where the bulk of new infections were in 2014. So we're talking about 1/5 of all infections. So cultural competence matters because of differences in health outcomes. What we also know is that there's been research on this, and this data is a little old, but it's still as relevant. It's a 2012 report from the Institute of Health, which revealed that racial and ethnic minorities tend to receive lower quality health care than non-minorities, even when access-related factors such as a patient's insurance status or income is taken into account. And then there's similar results in terms of African Americans and Hispanics. What we also know is in terms of HIV/AIDS health outcomes, disparities persist. The data has shown that racial and ethnic minorities with HIV die sooner than whites, and there's also differences in viral suppression. For example, women with HIV, even when they're linked to care, they tend to be less likely to stay in care or to achieve viral suppression. When such differences exist, we have to look at, morbidity and mortality at greater levels. That's called a health disparity. And a health disparity is a particular type of health difference that's closely linked to social and economic disadvantage. So the differences may occur by gender, race, ethnicity, education, disability, geographic location, sexual orientation, racism, among others. So this is what we're dealing with, and this is what we're going to address today. Now, obviously, the importance cannot be overstated. The premier document which provides the national blueprint and guidance for HIV prevention, care, and treatment is the National HIV/AIDS Strategy. And you can see that goal number 3 is highlighted. It's an explicit goal, and we know that one way of reducing health-related HIV disparities is through the provision of culturally and linguistically competent health services. Now, this slide simply reiterates what I mentioned in terms of a focus on the right people, right places, and right practices. Notice the populations that are named on this slide, the same folks that are considered priority populations as per the CDC in terms of gay and bisexual and other men who have sex with men, Black men and women, Latino men and women, people who inject drugs, youth, and people in the southern United States, as well as transgendered individuals. Now that we've discussed HIV/AIDS health-related disparities, let's review a few more of the concepts that will frame the rest of this discussion. So let's begin by talking about culture and what that entails. So we're talking about an integrated pattern of learned beliefs, behaviors, and customs, and values shared among a group of folks. So culture is really at the center of the work that we do. It influences how people receive health information, how they express symptoms and concerns about the health issue, how services are accessed, how rights and protections are exercised, and the quality of that care. So culture impacts every single one of these things. And you see the circles on the slide in front of you. We know that culture is also dynamic and that individuals, and most of us, identify with multiple cultures over the course of our lifetime. So when we use the word culture, we're not referring to race and ethnicity. I can tell you in doing this work so many times, what comes up is as soon as the word cultural competence comes up, folks immediately go to race, ethnicity, when there are so many different aspects to culture. So other examples of culture may include the drug culture, or ability, or family structure. Even professional culture is part of culture. So cultural competence, I see my slides are cut off for some reason. It entails a set of congruent practices, skills, attitudes, policies, and structures which come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enable us to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So the key here is really to produce positive change. HIV prevention practitioners must understand the cultural context of their target communities and have a willingness and skills to work within this context. This means drawing on community-based values and traditions and customs, and working with knowledgeable persons from and of the community to plan and implement our programs. And what I want to really point out here is that cultural competence is a developmental process, meaning it evolves over time. In other words, what we assume is that individuals and organizations are at various levels of awareness, knowledge, and skills along the cultural competence continuum. From here on out, we'll be talking about both individual and organizational level cultural competence, with emphasis on the latter, actually. So when we talk about individual level cultural competence, we're talking about an examination of our own attitudes and values and the acquisition of these values and how that transcends in the interaction between client and providers. This is an example of cultural competence where one person is aware of their own culture and worldview and their beliefs and behaviors and makes an attempt to engage and provide quality services. You do this by valuing difference, by recognizing challenging and negative feelings about a particular group, and acquiring knowledge about the cultures of people with whom one is working. And finally, we do this by investing in building relationships via trust and rapport. Organizational cultural competence is a lot more encompassing. So to achieve cultural competence, especially in terms of the work that we do, we need both. We need individual level cultural competence and organizational level cultural competence. Organizational level cultural competence requires a coordinated, concerted effort that may include interventions at the policy level, infrastructure building, program administration, and service delivery. To improve an organization's cultural competence, support from leadership within an organization is critical. We know that if there's support from the top, staff at all levels of the organization will be engaged in implementing the practices and the policies that are adopted by the leaders. So cultural competence makes a difference in access. It makes a difference in utilization and quality, and it influences health outcomes. Let's talk a little bit about the cultural competence continuum. So this framework was developed by Terry Cross, and it presents a framework for really understanding cultural competence. You see there's steps that go up. You know, the point is wherever you land in terms of a specific group, you want to get to the next level. So the goal is to move up. What's important to note here is that the characteristics of each stage of the continuum are not linear and are not meant to define an organization. Rather, these steps allow organizations to gauge where they are on the path to cultural competence with one or more of the groups and develop a plan towards enhancing their level of organizational cultural competence. What I want to emphasize here is that organizations will likely fall under different stages of the continuum depending on the characteristics of their organizational structure and factors such as client populations and cultural groups and subgroups. So for example, an organization serving a largely Puerto Rican community may find themselves somewhere else on this continuum with a demographic population shift which results in an influx of Mexican Americans where issues such as immigration status, citizen status, etc., acculturation have to be taken into account. So we may be culturally competent with one group, but we may not be with another. And I think that's the visual here on this slide and the takeaway. This slide simply reinforces some of what I said in terms of the stages, but I wanted to provide a few examples. So most of us doing this work, we're not anywhere near cultural destructiveness. And that's really, examples of that would be like anti-LGBT groups such as the Concerned Women for America or Aryan Nation groups that prescribe to white supremacy. Obviously, the destructiveness is clear. But that's sort of on the other side of the continuum. What we start seeing is cultural incapacity. So this may be an organization that may act paternalistic towards minorities, such as not asking a client about treatment options or using the "you don't know what is best for you" approach. So it's some subtle messages that cultural groups are neither valued or welcome. So an example of a structural cultural incapacity would be not having a handicap accessible entrance in the form of a ramp for your building. And then we go through the other stages. Cultural indifference and unawareness is where what we usually experience in doing this work in helping organizations become more aligned with the class standards. This is where, it's sort of like the one-size-fits-all approach. But what that really means is that the dominant culture leads. So it's sort of like, I don't see difference, but I really do. And this is where we want to, what we want to avoid, but because what we do know about HIV prevention and successful interventions is that tailored, targeted programs work best. And the other stages you can read at your leisure, but basically what we want to do is climb through these things and get to a stage of cultural competence, which is where organizations continuously assess themselves. We conduct needs assessment. We put policies in place. We train our staff so that we are aligned with the class standards and that our clients and the folks that we are trying to reach feel welcomed and are ready to receive services. So now that we've discussed healthcare disparities and cultural competence, the question may no longer be, hey, what's the connection? But rather, let's summarize a connection. And the provision of culturally and linguistically appropriate health services is an evidence-based strategy that addresses disparities and improves the quality of HIV prevention, care, and treatment among people of diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. So you should really think about cultural competence as an evidence-based strategy. It is not loose. It's not just how you greet a client. There are so many pieces to this that agencies can do to improve their level of cultural competence with the populations that we serve. But with so much diversity in this world, how do we as community-based organizations and as entities that are usually known for our connection to the community ensure that our prevention programs and services meet this criteria? Where do we begin? And that brings us to segment 2. So before moving along, let me quickly summarize what we've covered thus far. So we've talked about the basics of culture and cultural competence and made the connection between health disparities and cultural competence. Now I'm going to introduce the national standards for class, the national class standards. Culturally, sometimes I get my, the class stuff, I get tongue twisted. So culturally and linguistically appropriate services in health and healthcare. You can read this slide, but there are some words that come out in, I think I would call that color purple, which highlight what the national standards are about. The national standards provides a framework from which organizations can address disparities and promote health equity. It is a tool, but it's a tool. So no matter how great, it requires action on the part of organizations to achieve cultural competence. And as you'll see, the highlighted words, advance health equity, improve quality, and help eliminate healthcare disparities, resonates with our discussion. So now I'd like you to take a few minutes and just complete this poll. May I please have poll question number 1? I'm going to give everyone about, I guess, 10 seconds or less. All right, so I think we have I think everyone's pretty much done. And basically what we're seeing here is that folks have sort of heard, there's a very small percentage who are very familiar with class, but most folks have heard about class, but, lack a lot of information about class. And actually almost a third of you have not heard about class at all. So this is good. I'll let you know a little bit more about class. Can I have the presentation, please? Okay. So what I'd like you to do now is pull up handout 1. And if you were unable to download handout 1, I can sort of walk through it really quickly. We're not going to talk about the history of class, but it's important to understand that the intent behind these standards were developed by the Office of Minority Health in 2000, and that was almost 16 years ago. CLAS is intended to inform, guide, and facilitate required and recommended practices related to culturally and linguistically appropriate health services. So CLAS was proposed as a means to correct inequities that currently exist in the provision of health services. The standards are intended to be inclusive of all cultures and not limited to any particular population, group, or sets of groups. However, they are especially designed to address the needs of racial, ethnic, and linguistic populations that experience unequal access to health services. So in this segment, some of the stuff we're going to talk about, you can totally apply across your organization. Cultural competence is not just about HIV prevention, but it's a best practice in terms of health services delivery in general. So I'm going to go over what the CLAS standards look like very, very briefly. You have the handout, so you'll be able to use that as a reference if you desire more information. Additionally, there are links at the end of the PowerPoint that you can access to get more information. So Principle Standard 1 frames CLAS, and it describes the essential goal of the standards. So if all 14 standards were adopted, implemented, and maintained, this standard would be achieved. And this standard reads to provide effective, equitable, understandable, and respectful quality care and services that are responsive to diverse cultural health beliefs, practices, preferred languages, health literacy, and other communication needs. So Standard 1 speaks to creating a safe and welcoming environment at every point in contact. It speaks to making sure that individuals receive health care in a culturally and linguistically appropriate manner. And it also speaks to the communication needs of individuals so that folks can understand the health care and the services they are receiving and can participate fully in that. The CLAS standards are organized into the principal standards, and then there are three major themes. The first theme is governance, leadership, and workforce. And basically, this emphasizes the importance of CLAS implementation as a systemic responsibility. So it goes, it's from the boardroom to the front door. It requires the investment and endorsement of leadership and the support of all folks within an organization. So Standards 2 to 4 encompasses organizational policies, staffing patterns, and investment in employees and volunteers who work within the organization. Please remember you can use the box on the side to submit any questions, or if you just want to comment and you had an aha moment, I'd love to hear that as well. So theme number 2 of CLAS speaks to communication needs and services. So what we're talking about here are things like sign language, braille, oral interpretation, and written translation. So Standards 5 to 8 entails informing clients of language assistance services and providing those services by trained professionals. It also encompasses print and multimedia. We'll come back to this on the next slide for persons with limited English proficiency. The third theme of CLAS, engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability, underscores the importance of establishing responsibility for ensuring that CLAS is supported across organizations. This includes organizational policies and processes that reflect a culturally competent approach. We're talking about ongoing organizational assessments, input from the community, data collection, as well as service delivery. You'll see here listed under the standards 9 through 15, we're talking about who do you partner with? Is your philosophy aligned? Are your philosophies aligned in terms of healthcare provision? We're also looking at conflict and grievance procedures. Do clients know their rights? All of these things speak to aligning with CLAS and providing culturally competent care. So let me take a moment to go back to the theme of communication and language assistance and provide an example of how organizations can operationalize class. So I call this slide the walkthrough, and it's actually something you can do at your agency. Some of these images are from my agency, Proceed Inc., where we periodically do the walkthrough. So let's start with the picture on the left. What do people see when they enter the door? So that's the first question you ask. When someone comes in, what does the space look like? Then you have, moving sort of clockwise, you have Sarah. Sarah's our receptionist. Has your receptionist been trained? Does she know how to greet clients, or he? Or how does your receptionist address the needs of clients with limited English proficiency? Which brings us to signage. What kind of signage do you have to tell people to help direct your community members? It's also important to look at the images. What art and images do people see, and is it inclusive? Are your counseling rooms private? Have staff been trained not to have conversations about or with a client in public space? And finally, is cultural competence infused at every level of the organization, from the front door, which is the picture on your left, to the bottom right picture? You know, we need to make sure that cultural competence spans from the door to the boardroom. So this is one example, and I really encourage folks to do the walkthrough, because you learn a lot about your organization and how the community may see it. So the next slide, well, as we talk about how to operationalize class, the document is fine. How do we put it into use? Here are some examples in terms of how each of the domains can be addressed. So when we're talking about organizational values, we may be talking about funding. Is funding allocated to cultural competence activities, or is there a mechanism in place for collecting cultural competence related client and population level data? We're also talking about your governance and leadership. Do you have a community advisory board in place? And if so, what's the percentage of community members on your governing boards as well as your community advisory boards? For planning, monitoring, and evaluation, in thinking about that, you want to look at your data collection forms. Do you have a process in place for obtaining staff, client, and community input on cultural competence as well as your programs in general? And having appropriate data fields is so important. Example, you don't want to just have marital status, single, married, or gender, male, female. So these are some things that you can do. Yes, there are the funder requirements, but it still does not mean that as an agency you may have to adopt some of your forms so that it's more inviting for your target populations, or more welcoming, or less of a turnoff in the most basic terms. In terms of communication, we're talking about having protocols about when and how to elicit sensitive information to clients. So in the walkthrough, I talked about the importance of private counseling rooms. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. Or having a system in place to inform clients of their right to free interpretation and language services. This is also your protocols around marketing and how what you develop is validated. We need great staff, so an investment in cultural competence training is critical. It's also about articulating values on cultural competence and codes of conduct for dealing with clients and the community. In terms of your organizational infrastructure, again, an example may be, a small budget line to support culturally competent activities, or an annual, in-service training. It may also mean a way of training your peers to become, the navigators. So moving people to the next step and having a plan for that. And of course, the services have to be integrated. We need to look at how communities utilize the resources that we have, and if we're meeting the needs of the target populations. So we've covered a whole lot, and the task of achieving cultural competence does not seem so far removed. It seems like a lot, but many of you already do many of these things, but there's always room to improve. So we're going to move to this question, and I'd like you to take a minute to just respond. So 5 more seconds. I see it's still moving. Okay. So we can close the poll. Okay, so thanks so much, everyone. I'm just going to move back here for a second. What we see is that most of you already conduct surveys and focus groups, etc. And the second most popular response was that you facilitate regular meetings with the community advisory boards. About a third of you mentioned offering annual cultural competence training. So that's one immediate thing after this survey that you can talk to your leadership about, or if you are leadership, you can put in place. And also, fewer of you said that you post positive images of the groups or populations served. Think about how important it is to see a reflection of yourself or something that validates your life. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So that's something else that organizations can put into place. So let's look at handout 2. And again, I know some of you may not have had time to download, but what this is, it's a rapid assessment, and it provides key questions, open-ended questions that of organizational practices as it pertains to cultural and linguistic competence. So the questions are organized under the major themes: governance, communication, and continuous quality improvement and accountability. So my suggestion is really that you go through the assessment and see where your agency falls in general and with regard to a specific population or group, to see where you stand. And remember that organizations may find themselves on different levels of the cultural competence continuum with different populations. So in a nutshell, all in all, when all the themes are reviewed and we talk about class and what it's about, I love this quote. It's really about services that are respectful of and responsive to individual cultural health beliefs and practices, preferred languages, health literacy level, and communication needs, and employed by all members of an organization at every point of contact. And we're talking from the receptionist to the boardroom, as I talked about in the previous slide that I called the walkthrough. So now we're moving on actually to the third section. I see no questions or comments, but that's okay. We'll keep this moving. Maybe something will come to mind at the end of the webinar. So in this segment, segment 3, we're going to talk about the designated priority populations. And in the previous segment, we talked about class and how it can be applied to your HIV prevention programs and your organization as a whole. So now we're going to talk about the specifics in working with priority populations. But first, you know what, let's conduct a poll. Next slide, or next poll question, please. Okay, so we're going to close the poll. So you know what? Most of you work with these target populations. I think the most popular here, we're looking at gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men and young MSM, and the least popular in terms of who you work with, people who inject drugs, but it's still high at 67%. So as I always say, there are no, hard lines in HIV prevention. Most of us work with a little bit of everybody, and this just confirms that. So we're working with the people who are considered priorities, and I wanted to just, I love this quote, and it's a statement by President Barack Obama on the 35th anniversary of HIV/AIDS in America. The president acknowledged that while there is more work to do, the economically disadvantaged gay and bisexual men, especially those who are young and black, women of color, and transgender women all continue to face huge disparities. And he goes on to say, I'm confident that if we build upon the steps we've taken, we can finish the job. In my opinion, this is quite a statement that totally backs up all the data. It backs up this conversation we're having around cultural competence and the elimination of health disparities. And in my opinion, it gives us the fire for continuing our work. So let's talk about priority populations. We'll take a few minutes to discuss African Americans and Latinos. But before we begin, I have a word of caution. So a primary challenge in working with clients from diverse cultural backgrounds is being able to use cultural generalizations appropriately without losing sight of the individual client. So to overcome this, providers must keep in mind that variations occur between cultural subgroups. Individuals subscribe to group norms to varying degrees and factors, such as socioeconomic status, we're talking about education, acculturation, and English proficiency, have an enormous impact on a person's health beliefs and behaviors. So it is critical for us to think about characteristics other than race when we're working with African Americans and Latinos. Among all races and ethnicities, we talked about this, African Americans are the most disproportionately impacted group in terms of HIV. So what we want, here are some common themes in terms of African Americans. So the family structure is characterized by an extended family network, and this often includes non-related family members. So it's all the aunties and cousins that we meet. And it's also about adaptable family roles where grandparents and aunties may take on a parental role. The African American community usually has strong ties to the church and deeply held religious beliefs and affiliations. So churches, for example, have always played a huge social role in African American communities. But this is both positive and negative, especially when it comes to HIV prevention, as we know, in that churches can impact health-seeking behaviors. So for diseases such as diabetes and high blood pressure, they may have screening events. But there may also be a lack of discourse around HIV prevention because it's associated with folks who have same-sex partners. We're also looking at a distrust of institutions, and most African Americans have heard of Tuskegee, which allowed black men with syphilis to progress without treatment to see what the disease could do. So most of us in healthcare actually know about Tuskegee. But the repercussions of that still stands and manifests as a distrust for institutions, including government and medical establishment, as well as social services. There's also the use of natural remedies, and it's used frequently, including laying of hands and prayer, which is used to heal. I remember about 15 years ago when I worked with women with HIV, and they used St. John's wort as a supplement. However, this this herb actually had some negative interactions with HIV meds. So again, it's important that folks feel comfortable enough to disclose some of the cultural common practices. And finally, seniors are highly respected because aging represents authority and wisdom, and folks tend to keep things hidden within the family system because there is the fear of being disgraced, and that's a product of racism, stature in the community, etc. So again, by no means does this mean that your African American clients all have these common themes, but it does provide a reference point. So we're talking about mistrust of the medical community, limited knowledge of services, HIV-related stigma and discrimination, homophobia, and provider bias in decision making. This slide simply reinforces what I just covered. It's the manifestations of those themes I presented which result in barriers. So you can review these more closely on your own or in the attachments. In terms of working with the Latino community, we know that Latinos account for about 23% of the new diagnoses, right? I mentioned that in the beginning. So what we want to think about is the impact that immigration status may have on health seeking and interactions with providers. For example, there may be a fear that folks who may be in this country legally will be exposed if they seek care. We're also talking about acculturation. Acculturation is viewed as one of the key variables that practitioners need to take into consideration when working with Latino families. Familismo is also strong. Latinos tend to be highly group-oriented, and there's a strong emphasis placed on family as a major source of one's identity and protection against the hardships of life. This is a protective factor, but it can also be an issue when it comes to things like HIV disclosure or seeking treatment. Respeto is also important, and that's a high value on demonstrating respect in interactions with others. So these interactions are influenced by gender, social position, title, economic status, to name a few. But in a health encounter, this may manifest as a Latino client's hesitancy to ask questions or raise concerns for fear that being so might be perceived as disrespectful. So we know that healthcare providers and doctors especially are viewed as authority figures. This is where your navigation services can come in terms of advocating for the client and helping to steer the client so that their questions can be addressed. And machismo and marianismo are two terms that we've probably heard. Again, I have to start with the disclaimer that there are variations. And acculturation plays a key role in terms of how strongly we see machismo, which is I call it the king of my domain syndrome. But what this may manifest in is, the male figure, usually an elder male, making healthcare decisions. And it also is perpetuated by this expansive sexual appetite and a man's right to satisfy the desire in the way he chooses. In the same regard, when we talk about Marianismo, we're talking about the high value Latina women place on being dedicated, loving, and supporting wives and mothers. So again, some of these are protective factors, and some of these, when thinking about it in the healthcare context, can become a barrier. Fatalismo is used to express the belief that an individual can do little to alter their fate. So this may manifest in health beliefs that having HIV is an automatic death sentence. So as a result of fatalismo, Latino patients may be less likely to seek preventive screenings and may actually delay seeking health care. And finally, simpatica, which means kindness, and it refers to an emphasis on politeness. So again, Latinos expect healthcare providers to be personable And if someone seems hurried or detached, the client may feel that they are not respected. This then would reduce the likelihood of compliance with a doctor's recommendations or provider's recommendations and the treatment for follow-up. So you can see how these things come together and really impact, again, how we receive information about care, how we, what we do with that information, and even whether we access care and stay in care. So again, the themes listed here reiterate what I just discussed. I'm not going to go over it, but you have the slide for your own review. It simply reinforces what I actually just mentioned in the previous slide. So although the context might be slightly different, we do see some best practices in terms of working with African Americans and Latinos. So the first is to self-assess. So we talked about recognizing the cultural diversity among African Americans and Latinos, but it also means that we need to check ourselves, right? And we need to think about the assumptions that we have made about a particular group and how these assumptions may impact the information that you provide, how you provide the information, and how you interact with the client and how the client interacts with you. Remember, individual cultural competency matters. I've said this a lot when it comes to the discussion around PrEP. You know, there are two schools. There are those providers that really are still hesitant and have some, you know, misgivings about PrEP, and there are those that say, hey, take PrEP, you won't get HIV. So we just have to be careful about how we communicate messages to clients. We can give the facts, but we should also be in touch with how we feel about issues prior to disseminating the information so that that does not get muddied in the water or lost, you know, or in the translation process. We're also talking about being all-encompassing. So this is, again, looking at clients for who, as individuals, without just thinking about the generalizations, looking at home environment and where people grew up, who they grew up with, you know, gender, etc. These things are a lot more telling in many cases than the generalizations we just covered. And finally, we talk about prioritizing relationships. Nothing trumps establishing a relationship of trust and respect with your client. So it's about getting to know your client. We're also talking about communicating effectively, using simple and direct language and messages that can be communicated in plain language. And using vernacular that is familiar to the client. Sometimes images help, for instance. It's also a good idea to incorporate culturally based assessments into prevention and treatment plans. What does this mean? This is making cultural competence a part of your assessment. So you may want to ask, for example, when a client migrated to the U.S., because that speaks to a level of acculturation or certain cultural practices that one Latino client may have versus another who recently migrated to the U.S. Or you could ask about dietary practices or alternative or natural remedies used. So these are parts of a culturally based assessment. And finally, navigate the path to care, because access and utilizations are issues for both groups. Provide the support needed to not only refer the client, but to link them to essential medical and support services. We'll now move on to discussing best practices for working with young men who have sex with men and transgender persons of color. And it is likely that in this section you'll see some reoccurring themes. So the rationale for these recommendations is that research has shown that prevention and care models based on white MSM populations have not been as effective with other racial and ethnic groups. So young MSMs and transgender of color are different from others under the LGBT umbrella. So an understanding of these subgroups and the demographic factors is vital to providing the care that folks need. So we see that folks, it's not about being single issue. We have to talk about a holistic approach. It can't be just about HIV. That's what this, this statement really means. We have to make our programs about more than just HIV, even though there's a heavy emphasis on HIV. We need to make sure that our interventions and our programs are designed with the community in mind. So they must be customized, and they cannot be paternalistic, meaning we need to make sure folks are involved in the creation of these interventions from the get-go. So again, the community voice is critical. So when working with young MSM, which I already mentioned, MSM comprise the majority of new infections, especially young Black MSM. So it's important to keep the following in mind. These are all interrelated, these 5 bullet points here. So coming out challenges may be a result of, for instance, struggling with one's sexual identity, which in turn may be a result of internalized homophobia. So, one fear may be rejection of family and friends, and the lack of a supportive network that embraces all identities of a young MSM is also a challenge, because then everything is hidden and shrouded in secrecy, including health care. Therefore, making prevention and treatment and HIV prevention, such as PrEP or treatment for an HIV-positive young MSM, that more difficult. So these are just things to keep in mind. We also know that the research shows that there's a higher rate of alcohol and drug abuse among young MSM, and in particular. And a lot of times it's been described as a substitution for authentic connection and grieving. And of course, the social pressures and stressors that result from heterosexism and heteronormativity does little to validate the daily lives of young MSMs. So these things should absolutely be taken into account in the design of your HIV prevention programs. And the last bullet again speaks to the substitution of strong positive social networks through the use of social media. Well, it's the second bullet, actually. Finally, in working with MSMs, you should anticipate that clients may not self-identify as gay. And this slide pretty much presents options for asking about sexual orientation. You should note the open-ended nature of the questions. Are you in a relationship? Do you have a spouse, partner, or husband? Same-sex marriage is legal. You can't ask about husbands. How do you identify with regard to your sexual orientation? And are you sexually active should be followed up with another question as well. So when we're talking about what works, what are the characteristics of an ideal program setting for young MSM of color? These have been extracted from multiple articles and programs that serve young MSM and have been found to be effective. So the notion that if you build it, they will come has not proven successful with young MSM. Rather, a more inclusive approach is needed where MSM are involved in program development and design. We're also talking about investing in staff training, food. No matter what, it's always a winner, because we know that culturally food represents a welcome to my house. It serves as a great equalizer. It's about bringing people to the proverbial dinner table. So we know that snacks, beverages, food is really important when working with young folks, and I think, to be honest, all folks in general. Access is also important. So we're looking at location and transportation, but so is utility. We know that, especially when working with young folks, we may want to make sure we have extended hours, weekend and evening hours. Flexible language. You should ask clients about their preferred language and try to provide services in their preferred language if possible. There should also be opportunities for young MSM to showcase their skills and to use the skills that they've learned in your program, whether it's in employment or volunteer opportunities. And The next two bullets speak to sort of like the one-stop shop model, in that we know that integrated care works best. So on-site access to medical and preventive and pharma services is a best-case scenario. However, if you don't have that scenario, you make sure that there's a seamless link from one to the next. And decision-making should be a part of HIV prevention. We talked about inviting visuals and the need for images that are self-affirming. Intake form language should also be a part of this. It's not on the list, but we should think about intake form language and make sure it's safe, judgment-free, and non-discriminatory. Okay. So now we're going to move into discussing folks who are transgender. And if you could take a minute and complete this poll, that would be great. So we're talking about what's your level of competency working with transgender persons. All right, so let's close the poll. What we have is more than half of you who've said, I'm competent, but I could stand to learn new strategies and tips. And then I think the next most popular response was, I'm not very experienced. I consider myself to have basic knowledge and skills. So folks folks know what they're doing, but willing to listen. So this next section, let's just jump right into it and talk a little bit about best practices in working with transgender persons. So in working with transgender persons, there are a few things you should be aware of that may facilitate a positive client-provider cross-cultural encounter, right? So first, it's important to do that self-assessment that we talked about a few slides back. What are your biases, your perceptions about people who are transgender? Listen to how clients refer to themselves in terms of the pronouns and the names and genders and the use of that language, and model the behavior, right? Also, folks should really consider the pros and cons of client self-disclosure or non-disclosure. So do not let curiosity about body parts come into play. Consider how this information may be relevant to the provision of services. Is it relevant, or is it just, I'd like to know? Again, if you're unsure, ask questions respectfully. So these are just some tips from persons who are transgender to those of us that provide the services. Again, this slide just provides an example of asking about some of those questions respectfully. It's for your review at your convenience, and it provides some suggestions for asking about questions around gender identity and sexual orientation. So if we summarize the best practices in terms of HIV prevention for transgender persons, there are a few key themes, and I think this list is really comprehensive and excellent. And as you think about your program, whether you're expanding your program, proposing a new program, you may just want to think about how you address each of these areas. So remember the walkthrough. Is your space a safe space? How are you validating the population and groups that you are serving? In terms of language, remember to ask clients what terms they prefer to be called, and be mindful that folks may not conform to traditional terms such as gay or trans or bisexual, etc. So it's really important, and we've said this time and time again, to address to keep the community engaged. So have members of the transgender community actively and meaningfully involved. and address social inequality as it pertains to transgender persons. Advocate on behalf of transgender people. You should also think about obtaining feedback from your clients. It's really critical that we hear what folks have to say about the services that they are receiving. And this is in line with theme 3 of the class standards. A few more best practices. We talked about the importance of staffing, diversifying your staff, having a few staff members that are
come here. Oh, come here, Mama. Come on. Let's go.
Huh. Okay, that was that was a nice interruption, but I'll continue. So in terms of staffing, we're talking about diverse staffing and experienced staff. In terms of the organization, we mentioned the need and the importance for training everyone from the receptionist to the boardroom in terms of what your agency is doing around cultural competence. This next bullet, collaborations and partnerships, I cannot say enough how important this is. You want to collaborate and think about who you're partnering with. It's not just about the person the agency that may provide a service that you don't, but make sure that your philosophy is aligned, that when you send your clients there, they will be treated with the same level of respect and dignity. Or facilitate that relationship so that they are treated with the same respect and dignity. And again, holistic care is important. We want to make sure that it's not, again, just all about HIV prevention. Let's talk about how we're going to engage folks and keep them in services, and a lot of times that's by providing a host and a spectrum of services. So now we'll move into people who inject drugs. And this is the last priority population, so we are starting to wrap this up. So when working with people who inject drugs, it's important to engage in dialogue with folks to better understand their histories and experiences as it pertains to their drug use. It is actually a critical part of the process of IDU, people who inject, cultural competency with people who inject drugs. See, I am also going back to injection drug users, the correct terminology being people who inject drugs. So clients inject drugs for various reasons. We know some of which can be grouped into categories of pleasure, trauma, or exchange. And we have to recognize that clients have relationships with their behaviors, and there are benefits and consequences involved in these relationships. We also need to recognize that stigma is a significant part of the experience of people who inject drugs. So understanding stigma is important so that we avoid reinforcing it and to better counteract its negative psychosocial effects. So when we talk about best practices for people who inject drugs, here are some tips. Staff should be trained on the drug use continuum. So we know there is use, misuse, and abuse. Abuse is where we have addiction. But this means that treatment on demand is important, meaning agencies should be prepared to respond or refer clients who are ready for treatment. But on the flip side, a client who's just not ready, there should be tips about how to reduce harm. So a harm reduction approach is also important. And you need to know where your agency stands on each of these issues. Again, recognizing the role of stigma in health seeking. Recognize that there are multiple social inequalities. And people who inject drugs are highly stigmatized, as we know. So we're also talking about leaving the paternalistic attitude at home, meeting clients where they are rather than where we'd like them to be, and providing non-judgmental and non-coercive services. This is where, again, a philosophy or the practice of harm reduction may be helpful if clients aren't ready to quit using drugs. And we need to talk about avoiding assumptions about client capability based on drug use. it's really interesting because we know that there's a continuum of drug use, but a lot of times there are assumptions made in terms of how functional a drug user is, including people who inject drugs. There are quite a few functional drug users, so that should not prevent anyone from making a referral to treatment, etc. And again, we're ensuring that all clients have input in the creation of policies and programs. So let's include the folks that we're designing for. I think it's program design 101 at this point. And the navigation piece is really important, especially when working with people who inject drugs, because the drug use is maybe a major part of their lifestyle, especially if they're in the stage of addiction or abuse. So facilitating access to these health and support services are very important. And as I mentioned, choosing the right partners or collaborators. So what you may not want to do is refer clients, for instance, an active person who injects drugs for services or supports at an agency that has zero tolerance, at a zero tolerance facility. That would not be a good idea for anyone. So again, I know most of you already do many of these things. Some of this is sort of like a refresher. Hopefully there are also some tips that you can take and build, you know, as you think about how best to work with your target populations and how to present this as you consider applying for PS 17-1704. So in a nutshell, when all is said and done, these next two slides summarize best practices across priority populations. I would say if you, out of all of these slides, if you just need a quick takeaway from section 3, these two slides, 54 and 55, are the ones you may want to look at, right? So I'm just going to briefly review what I mean by each of these. So we're talking about grounding your work in the community. So that means developing partnerships with young MSM and transgender people of color and the organizations that serve them. We know that community involvement ensures acceptability, appropriateness, and relevance of interventions, programs, and services for young MSM, transgender people of color, and people who inject drugs. And center your work. What this means is, again, one size does not fit all. So we know that interventions and programs are most effective when they incorporate age, racial and ethnic issues that contribute to HIV risk, and issues of stigma and discrimination that are specific to young MSM, transgender people of color, and people who inject drugs. We also need to continue to think holistically, or think about how we can make our HIV preventions more holistic. So consider approaches that not only focus on the individual, but on social networks and communities and organizations where your target population lives, works, and plays. You also want to get the facts. So this means conducting thorough needs assessments and evaluations and using the data in program planning and improvement and disseminating what you've learned so that others can learn from it. Recruitment and retention is probably one of our most popular requests that we receive from community-based organizations in terms of capacity building. And recruitment and retention strategies should consider the unique needs and circumstances of young MSMs, transgender persons, and people who inject drugs. So we need to make the effort to go beyond what is convenient and bring education and services to their neighborhoods and communities. And what I can say is sometimes when we do TA, technical assistance, around recruitment and retention issues, we see that folks have had the same strategy for 5 years, right? So what we need to, and that's part of the issue, like we know that, you know, environments change, and we want to make sure that as environments change, our strategies change. We do, you know, we do mapping and we conduct assessments on a continual basis so that it can inform how we recruit and engage people and retain them in our programs. And let's talk about access. We need to increase access to health care. If we don't have central locations, we should make transportation available. We should provide services in multiple languages. And we should have trained providers who understand HIV and healthcare issues affecting these populations that we're talking about. Again, it can't be reemphasized that there must be some agency investment in terms of training staff at making sure that folks are on the same page in terms of how best to provide culturally and linguistically competent services and align with the class standards. And finally, none of us are funded to do advocacy work, but we can certainly advocate for structural and systemic change. We can collaborate with community partners to advocate for policy development and social change that identifies and addresses how HIV among transgender persons and MSMs of color, as well as people who inject drugs, is impacted by housing, employment, transphobia, racism, violence, and it's too many to name, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say, which is we need to get involved and make sure that we advocate for the communities that are most disenfranchised and most disproportionately impacted by HIV. So in the end, our goal is really to identify and serve people and our communities and provide the best care possible. And cultural and linguistic competence in HIV prevention and care and treatment is really about better access. It's about improved usage, improved care coordination, better retention in treatment, better health outcomes, fewer health disparities, and more health equity, right? And finally, I conclude with these words, again from President Barack Obama, again on the 35th, not 50th, anniversary of HIV/AIDS in America. And he says, we've learned that stigma and silence don't just fuel ignorance, they foster transmission and give life to a plague. We've seen that testing, treatment, education, and acceptance can not only save and extend lives, but fight the discrimination that halted progress for too long. So we don't want to wait another 35 years. That's it. And this completes the talking part of my presentation. The next few slides, when you download them, here's a list of culturally resources if you want more information on cultural competence. I believe in the RFP there's a full section on cultural competence and how you're going to demonstrate that. This slide set should provide some tools and tips that you can use, and these resources certainly help as well. So I'm more than willing to take any comments or questions if folks would just type your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pemberton, for that really fantastic presentation. Just a reminder for everyone who's on the platform that you can submit your questions through the pod on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. We still have another 8 minutes left for our webinar, and so we definitely would welcome your questions about anything that was covered today.
So I actually just received a private message with a question, so I'm going to share it with the group. And the question is, just bear with me 1 second, do we need to include the class standards in our 17-1704 application? And again, so here's my response. The class standards provide a blueprint for aligning your organization to culturally and linguistically appropriate services. I have seen nothing that says that you have to include class as part of this proposal, but CDC can probably speak to that. But again, I would say the information presented here is applicable in every situation, and it's a best practice. So I hope that's helpful. What I can say is that there are elements of class that certainly align with the goals and objectives of this RFP. So thank you for the question. I don't know if there are any more questions.
Giselle, it looks like we have a couple more questions that have come in. So the first
Oh,
of those
wow.
questions,
Okay.
yeah, thank you. The first of those questions is, in terms of considerations, are there particular strengths of YMSM that we should keep in mind if we're coming from a strengths-based approach?
That's great. I think it's really important. First of all, let me just say it's really important that we keep a strength-based approach, right? And again, without knowing the individual story of a young YMSM, I would say from a strength-based approach, the first thing you may want to do is congratulate that young MSM for coming in for services, right? Then you'd probably want to find out some of the stuff that we talked about in terms of doing a culturally based assessment. You know, find out about this person's network. If they do have a network, you want to emphasize the positives. But again, that's where the generalizations may not work across the board. Use the strengths-based approach to elicit the information that you need to figure out how best to place that individual in a health care program, whether it's prevention or care and treatment, that's conducive to, one, acknowledging the strengths that exist, but also addressing any deficits.
Thank you, Giselle. We have another, not a question, but a comment from a participant. Please be mindful that many trans women inject hormones and often share needles. Rarely, however, do we classify them as IDUs, but in this case, they are putting themselves at high risk for HIV infection via syringes. So thank you for that participant for bringing that up. And then one more question before we close. What is a community advisory board?
So a community advisory board, most organizations, it's something that most organizations put in place. It's usually comprised of anywhere from 8 to 12 members. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. And basically it's comprised of community stakeholders, including members of the target population that are there to inform the agency about trends with a specific target population, that are there to assist with program design, as well as to monitor implementation to help guide. These are sort of like this is like your external review board, right? So you want to present or ask them to help you with the design and implementations of programs. You want to present your progress to this group, and you want to elicit their feedback about how you may address any challenges that you see in your program. A community advisory board is an absolute best practice, and every organization should have a community advisory board in place with representatives from the communities and populations and subgroups that you're targeting.
Excellent. With that, we have no more questions at this time.
Well, wow. Well, thank you so much. Folks